So does it look like we're recording? I can't even.
Um,
Yes, we are. There's the
we are
minute. So there's,
recording,
there's
yes.
an awkward beginning that I've got to kind of cut out.
No, let's
So,
keep it. I think it's beautiful.
Yep, so you say hi to Paul and Allie.
Hi, Dave.
All right. So what we're going to pick up with is Commander-in-Chief. That's, so we looked at the idea of executive power, the power to faithfully execute law. Now we want to see kind of again what this power of Commander-in-Chief is on paper, but then it's reality, and is it being used as is intended, right? So when we look at the power of Commander-in-Chief, what it does, well, you contrast it for me. What does it effectively give the president power to do in contrast to congressional power? So when we think about war, what's the congressional power? And then contrast it to what the president's able to do, Angela.
So Congress can technically like declare war,
Yep.
like announce that we're going to war with someone, while like the president can technically wage war.
Good.
So he can like send troops in.
So which one supersedes the other? Which one trumps the other? Congress can declare war. President essentially can wage war. He gets to direct the troops. So which one supersedes the other?
I think Congress, because Congress can make the president call back troops.
You're getting into the War Powers Act, and we'll see if that's actually effective. Kerrigan.
Well, I would argue president just because he can physically send the troops. He's
Okay.
needed in the war.
Where's our evidence that Congress, we don't need a declaration of war to wage war?
Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah,
And Vietnam, all wars after World
all
wars after
there's a-
World
there's a
War
better- yeah,
War II.
all wars after World War II, essentially, or all. We got to be careful about wars, I guess. All
conflicts.
all
Armed,
conflicts, all kind of military encounters, right? So, really, again, this vague language essentially gives the president a power that supersedes congressional power, perhaps contrary to the framers' intent, in that we obviously want war, which is a something that we want to think very critically of. We want that to be kind of a deliberative act. But the nature of war is such that sometimes you have to act swiftly, you have to act unilaterally, you have to act with maybe a certain degree of secrecy, right? We'll tie that to national security here in a second. So we've got a lot of evidence that Congress typically defers. And again, there's a logic to it as well. Like I said, not only does conflict sometimes demand swift and unilateral action, what's the impact in terms of how we evaluate political officials when it comes to war? There's kind of a rule of thumb as to how things go. What's the rule of thumb?
There's like, the shorter the war is, the higher your popularity will be.
So immediately when we get into the conflict, what happens to popularity rates?
Skyrocket.
They skyrocket. As it draws on,
It-
plummets, right? So, we expect swift and kind of immediate success typically, and when you begin to drag it out in terms of lives and resources, negative attention happens. So again, it's a way to, you rally around the troops whom, it doesn't matter your politics with a given war, you obviously support the troops. They're serving us. They don't have a say politically in being called up necessarily to go into combat. So because we want to support the troops fairly unconditionally, regardless of how we feel about the war, we find the most convenient thing to rally around, and that's the president. Why? There's always the answer.
It's one guy.
Singular nature, right? So we're going to rally around the troops by rallying around the president. That's a natural kind of outlet for those feelings. But again, he also becomes the natural target as a war drags on. And then, consequently, Congress is fine with both the popularity soaring, because do they need it? Do they need that kind of boost? What advantage means they don't need that boost?
Numbers.
Say it again.
Numbers.
So yeah, it usually would come back to numbers. What's this 90 to 95 number that I'm hinting at?
Incumbency.
They've got this incumbency advantage that even though we've got low evaluations of Congress, they are going to get reelected, provided they don't do anything major in terms of a screw up. So I don't need that popularity surge. I'm just looking to avoid the negative press and attention typically. Colby, question.
I was just gonna say, with, like, the way, like, the people, like, rally around for the, like, the president for war.
Yep.
And they, like, so is that the same thing that happens, like that's how you wind up with people outside of, the White House saying, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Like, they're blaming him.
Yeah.
But has there ever been times where they come after Congress first?
You might see it in the vote, like, in the most recent election, the idea of like, were we right to go into Iraq and Afghanistan? Were we right to kind of do a troop surge? Is what should we be doing in Syria? And a lot of what Trump was trying to do was to try to hang it around, the Democrats, and how they might have voted on a particular issue. So you can see it come up often as like a campaign issue, where, one side is using it to kind of portray the other side as misguided or not patriotic. So you can definitely see it being used as an issue there. Do you see public backlash? What's interesting is I think from what you're talking about there, the chants were directed at LBJ, but this is where we often learn the lesson of people coming back, having fought the war, also faced all this negative, reaction where people yelled and spit at them and, called them baby killers and things like that. And I think that's where we learn the lesson to begin to try to differentiate between the policy and the policy makers and the people waging the war. And it's tricky to figure out who am I angry at and where to point it. So I do think that part's circumstantial. Good. So let's look at, again, because of this, because of Vietnam, as you raised, we do decide that this power is perhaps a little too open-ended. The vague language allowed the president to have the ability to wage war and enter into conflict. And here we have multiple occasions where this is large-scale stuff with no congressional declaration of war. They'd simply cede authority, or they'll call it a police action. So we want to rein them in with the War Powers Act. And again, that's in response to Vietnam. 3 provisions, right? What's the first one? We're going to send troops into conflict.
I might be jumping ahead, but is it that like they can only be there for 60 days?
So yeah, hold on to that one. So the first thing is when I send them, the president has done it unilaterally. Congress might not know.
He must get congressional approval within 48 hours.
Good, so it's actually not
Whenever
necessarily
possible.
approval,
Oh, he must
notification.
notify
So I'm gonna let Congress know within like 48 hours, comma,
Whenever possible.
when possible. And that obviously gives you there's a logic to it. What would make it not possible?
National security.
National security. You're putting someone in harm's way by kind of giving out troop position or battle strategy or whatever. And that gives it a degree of kind of cover in terms of the clock. Then the clock starts running. So what were you gonna say?
The president only has like 60 days of the troops being deployed without Congress's approval.
Good. And then if Congress doesn't approve, what's the timetable there?
30 days.
30 days to remove, right? So there's this kind of 90-day running clock that you could arguably figure out how to shift a little bit by shifting the nature of the encounter. But at any point, what can Congress do?
Change the timetable.
Well, yeah, they could change the timetable, but they don't need to wait like 60 days or 30 days. What are they able to do at any point during this kind of deployment of troops? Call them back, right? However, what's the catch with that one? Where they're negating a presidential direction of the executive branch, in this case, troops.
He doesn't listen.
Yeah, he could ignore.
And you have to know.
I'll give you a hint, INS versus Chadha.
Oh, wait.
I am negating, I'm Congress, and I'm negating an act of the executive branch.
So they're enacting legislative veto.
It's a legislative veto, right? Which INS versus Chadha, that immigration case, actually said is unconstitutional. Now, all of this really doesn't matter. I don't know what's happened up here. All of this doesn't really matter in some level. Like, what's on paper doesn't matter. It's really a matter of if the president is doing something, is Congress allowing it or are they objecting? Because what we find is that rarely do they, raise a fuss in terms of the timetable or use this legislative veto, right? So arguably, they could call him back, the president would have to object. Or arguably, the president can kind of continue to go beyond the parameters here, Congress would have to object. And, you know, even though this is in place, both sides kind of, you know, I think the reality still is, hey, singular nature of the executive branch, the nature of war, you know, unless there is some sort of political expedience to it, we Congress are gonna take a backseat. That's typically the course.
So, if Congress decided to like use the call back and like legislative veto, could the president like challenge it in court? Like,
Yeah,
call
that's
it-
that's exactly what I was just indicating. It's essentially still, I think, an open-ended issue. Because largely, again, you still see occasions of Congress negating acts of the executive branch, and sometimes the executive branch lets them get away with it. So it suggests that we need to more specifically define when and where a legislative veto is okay and when it isn't. So, again, when you guys like to give me these hypothetical situations, the reason I don't often have answers is because you need the precedent to be established, to establish the norm. And there's a lot of things we haven't thought of yet. So again, I always like to highlight with this too, the idea of Bush, and you have the height of his popularity. You know, George Herbert Walker Bush higher in terms of, and that had a lot to do with the economy at that point, which then really dips in a recession. But he's almost as high as Dad, and this 2001 date coincides with 9/11. And then you have, you know, the plummet because of, you know, we're not only in Iraq, we're not only in Afghanistan, but we're in Iraq. Those wars drag on, and then we have we're still there, and then we have the economic, you know, essentially meltdown with the housing market collapsing, and it brings down a lot of the big banks. So that's, again, if you were talking about this, you'd want maybe not some exact numbers, but this is how you'd illustrate to kind of talk about that rally around the president impact.
Everybody loves Kennedy, it looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, he never dips below that 50% mark, right? But
He didn't really have enough time.
But, yeah, there's a reason. Okay, so the next, yes, question? Yep, so the next power I wanna look at, and again, we're just trying to sophisticate it. You guys had the ability to list before, but we wanna not just list, we wanna be able to explain, and we wanna see how it's used in reality. So what we're looking at here is the pardoning power, and this is the one that kind of is jaw-dropping for a lot of people. Because what you're able to do, again, singular nature, is unilaterally essentially pardon someone for an offense, which means basically, it's interesting, if you pardon someone, it isn't that you've declared them innocent, right? There's arguments, constitutional scholars argue, by taking a pardon, you are in fact admitting guilt. What you're doing is giving them clemency. You're giving them essentially forgiveness for the crime. And it's a fairly blanket level of clemency. The only place that I can't use it is in a case of impeachment. So if someone is, so yeah, it's essentially, there are no limits to it. And it's like, holy cow, wait a minute, you mean the president could come in and simply unilaterally pardon somebody for an egregious crime that has overwhelming evidence for? What's the logic for this, right? Again, you've got to go back to our biggest fear with the judicial branch, the greatest wrong that we can do with the court system.
Convicting someone who's innocent.
Wrongfully convicting somebody who is innocent. The court system does not operate quickly. The justice system does not operate quickly. It shouldn't necessarily. We want it to take a long time to make sure we get something right. But it similarly may take a long time to undo something. So why do we give the president this ability to pardon? What does it allow me to do with this egregious wrong?
Just like an instant fix.
Instant fix. I can't give you back the 20 years you've been in jail, but I can get you out as swiftly as possible. I can get you out fairly quickly, right? So this is a final safeguard against wrongful conviction, and it allows a kind of an immediate remedy. The problem is, here are your examples of how it's often used. It's often used in the waning days of a president's term to maybe do some political payoffs is kind of a strong language, I suppose. And I don't necessarily mean that, but what I mean is there's a right that they wanted to wrong, but it was gonna be politically damaging. So they do it in the final days as a way to kind of minimize that fallout. What's gonna be damaged in this case is their reputation, their legacy. Ford pardons Nixon. Again, Nixon resigned before formal charges of impeachment were brought up. There was no conviction because of where he resigned. They could have gone on with the procedure, right? You can't pardon someone for a conviction of impeachment. Basically, Ford rips the Band-Aid. Basically says, we're gonna end that process now. Maybe that was a good thing for the nation. It was certainly not good for Ford's career. One-term president. Carter pardons the people that dodged the Vietnam War by going to Canada or North. There's over 10,000 of them. Again, that may have taken a contentious issue and brought a conclusion to it, but Carter is a one-term president for a number of reasons. Bush comes in, and you have to know the Iran-Contra scandal, and that's usually we do that in a big-time rush within our history classes. Essentially, this is a arms for hostage deal, and I'll go into it in more detail later if we don't quite know about it, but it's essentially we're prohibited from selling arms to this group called the Contras. They consider themselves freedom fighters fighting against a communist government in Nicaragua. Congress has a specific law saying don't get us dragged into that, don't sell arms to them. But there are some figures, Ollie North and a few other figures, that are doing it covertly, and they're using the money to broker a deal with Iran to free some US hostages. That all comes out, and every single one of the Reagan administration goes, I forgot, or I don't remember, or I don't recall. It's a messy, messy kind of affair, and you're curious as to how far it goes up. Bush essentially rips that Band-Aid off, saying this is gonna tear apart the nation, I'm gonna forgive these individuals, one-term president. Clinton uses it for a number of people. The one that seems most self-serving is this guy named Mark Rich, who is a financier, who is charged with tax evasion and embezzlement. He flees to, I forget where he goes, Switzerland, and Clinton pardons him, and it's like, what's the logic to this one? Well, maybe he's wrongfully accused, maybe it's kind of harmful, but then you see that Mark Rich's ex-wife had given $1 million, I think it's $1 million to the Democratic Party. That really tarnished kind of Clinton in terms of his use of the pardon. So you see all these people kind of using it, and we don't remember the ones where it was used maybe justly, we remember these. And it does damage the legacy. You've had your hand up for a bit.
Say a president went like rogue or insane, right? Could he technically pardon like every prisoner in like the entire country? And just
I
cause
would
chaos?
think, I would think that you would quickly see some enactment of a safeguard. That would be beyond the pale. Technically, is there a limit to the number of people they pardon? Ironically, you've kind of set me up for this one. You know, how did Obama use it? Well, Obama used it to pardon over 1,000 individuals. And it really was on things like drug crimes. A lot of it had to do with the fact that there are mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines that have taken people who are convicted of drug-related crimes, but what might be considered petty drug-related crimes, and they give them massive sentences, including when you work in the 3 strikes rule. And what you often see is that there's also a correlation between the type of drugs being used and the type of sentencing in race, right? Crack cocaine, a cheaper drug, might be more used by low-income groups. Cocaine, a designer drug, might be more used by white affluent people. Crack cocaine had major kind of penalties and time for it. Regular cocaine, or designer cocaine, or whatever you'd call it, it had lighter penalties.
I got the book all on right here.
Yeah, okay.
I got
So
economics, I don't run a drug guide.
so good. So what you're going to see here is there really were, again, tens of thousands of inmates, mostly African American, Hispanic, locked up when we did this war on drugs. They're serving like decades for these drug crimes. There was a bipartisan commission, the Koch brothers, you remember that name? Mm-hmm. They're financing essentially the conservative side, a lot of kind of conservative candidates and races and issues. were together with a bipartisan commission, including Hillary Clinton, saying, we have to fix this. The problem is Congress couldn't get their act together to enact any reform, and Obama acted unilaterally using the pardon. So there's a big number. The entire prison population, chances are if the president went that mentally off the rails that they were going to do something, I would hope the 25th Amendment would kick in before that. And there would be somebody that would slow the process down until they could enact that.
Imagine
Who
the
has the
chaos.
most pardons? Is it Carter with the 10,000?
I want to say yes. I'm not certain, but that certainly that huge, go ahead, that huge blanket kind of system would do it. The question is, do we also include, there's the other use of the pardon.
Turkeys.
There's a tradition of going ahead and routinely pardoning a turkey on Thanksgiving.
Also, Congress passes a sweeping tax overhaul, Republicans' first major legislative victory under President Trump. That was 5 minutes ago.
All right, so
Wait,
there it
what?
is. We will talk about that because that was an interesting back and forth. Again, you saw conference committee in that one. You saw different versions that had to be reconciled, and so the House had to vote twice on it. Essentially, they passed. Well, they had to vote 3 times on it, actually. They passed their version, the Senate passed their version, the House passed a new version, the Senate passed a different one, the House went back and passed the one that the Senate passed. So there's your sweeping overhaul of the tax system. It is the first, again, time that alignment of we don't have divided government in this case.
Right.
We do have partisan politics, but that's the first time the alignment has finally kind of worked in Trump's favor here within the first year, where he's got his major legislative victory. Okay?
So according to this, FDR has the most. So it doesn't mention Carter pardoning the 10,000.
Okay.
It mentions the highest is Franklin D. Roosevelt with the pardon of 2,819 individuals.
Makes sense.
And
Four terms.
Then Truman, then Eisenhower, then Wilson, then it goes down from there.
Okay.
To H.W. Bush with the least,
Least.
74.
So those,
So William Henry Harrison didn't have a chance.
William Henry Harrison is last in almost all categories, right? Okay, power of appointment. So this is one I saw you guys, obviously a little shaky on. And again, look what I've done with each power. We've kind of described it on paper, and then we've looked at how it's used in reality, and then we've thought about, is this power being used in the manner that it's intended? Is it kind of being effectively used? So here's power of appointment, and the power of appointment is, in many instances, uniquely checked by the Senate's power of advice and consent. Remember, there are certain unique things that the Senate weighs in on that gives it its unique status or stature. It's more elite status, right? So there they are in bold: treaties and ambassadors, as well as other kind of foreign officials, ministers and consuls. That, again, explains in part why the Senate is thought of having a foreign policy expertise, unique to the House, or beyond what the House has. The House obviously looks at these issues as well, but they're thought of as the experts. They also have the power of confirmation. Their power of advice and consent means they confirm judges. And primarily we think of the Supreme Court, but it's any federal judge that is appointed, they would weigh in on. They also get to approve the cabinet, okay? So those are the kind of unique powers of advice and consent. When we look at just the, if we zero, we could talk about treaties, and historically, do they get ratified? There's obviously the notable exception with Wilson, right? Trump just backed out of the Paris Accord. Typically with treaties, what you think about is all the work that, as hard as it was to pass that tax bill, can you imagine wrangling, 30 nations to kind of agree on something? And getting all of their individual whatever their governmental kind of mechanisms are to approve it in the same form in 30 different places. So typically, these things get, if there's a treaty that the president has ratified, Congress, often knowing what it took to get there and the overwhelming global consensus it may have taken to get there, might defer. But there are some notable exceptions, right? With respect to judges and the power of appointment, we talked about judges. 82% of the time, there's an approval rate for the Supreme Court, right? what's hidden in that number, though? That sounds like they're just a blank check for president. Whoever the president nominates, 80% of the time they'll confirm. Again, why is the threat of a check often more effective than the use of a check? What do we know has happened behind the scenes prior to this 80% approval rate?
It forces them to pick a more moderate candidate.
Yeah, because the president knows that there is a chance of this check being used. If there is divided government, if the president is of one party and the Senate is of the other, the president will immediately do that mental math and pick maybe something, a candidate that's more moderate or mainstream. The idea is they don't want the failure of a nominee shot down. That damages political capital. It makes them look like they don't know what they're doing, right? In terms of the other positions, well, you know, there's over, again, we talked about 3 million executive workers, right? 3,000 of them are appointees. And what you see is a fairly high 97% approval rating. So again, that seems pretty robust. These are more kind of obscure positions. Maybe this is more of a blank check. Does the Senate and Congress have time to kind of weigh in on these things? Well, the one area they do, and again, it's hidden, is with judges, right? Federal judges, again, there is an ideological issue. It typically is abortion. That is that wedge issue. And what is the tactic that they use, we've been over this like 15 times, to kind of block these judges? What does the Senate use? They use the filibuster in a what proof majority?
Cloture.
Cloture proof. What's the magic number?
41.
To have 60 or
You need 60 to invoke cloture, which means you are
41.
cloture proof with 41. It's a weird 3/5 math, because they just want to make the AP course difficult. And this isn't the only way that it's difficult. There's cloture has kind of different rules in different scenarios, so this is literally the generic one. Because they've kind of given themselves, because of its maybe potential abuse, to kind of stall, you know, the amount of time that it takes for them to actually approve of a judge, leaving those positions vacant. They've exercised the what option when it comes to judicial nominees? The nuclear option, right, or nuclear.
Nuclear.
How did George Herbert W. Bush used to say it?
Nuclear.
There it is. Right?
Nuclear. That's not even a word.
So again, this is a way that you see kind of just from a graphic image that the numbers are going up. And it caused them to say, look, our numbers are gonna change. So you can have a simple majority vote when it comes to judicial nominees to invoke cloture. They haven't used it yet for legislation. Sometimes I feel like if the tax bill hadn't passed, they probably would have exercised the nuclear option, to be honest with you, because I think we're that dysfunctional in terms of that branch. There is this, both sides are guilty of it at different points, where they don't do things through regular order, where they're not having the hearings, doing it in an open way. It is largely just looking to ram things through using a numeric advantage. And that means simply the other side will unravel it when they're able to, if they get the numbers. So on one level, that idea of compromise, political compromise, seems to be something in crisis, where you build a consensus. It takes 60 to pass good legislation, right? If that filibuster goes away, again, I would maintain, wow, it looks like it's being used abusively, but it is what makes the Senate the Senate. You know, you want legislation that is a product of overwhelming consensus, where they have to kind of cater to both sides. That's a scary thing to think about this going away. All right, so hopefully they don't. I gotta update my numbers there. So, let's talk quickly about ways around that stalling technique that we haven't introduced yet. So what's interesting is, you know, presidents have come up with a couple of different ways around it. So Clinton would simply, look, I'm not gonna get my nominee in. Whether it's a judge or a person for one of the federal bureaucracies. So I'm gonna give them a title of acting. Kind of a brilliant way around it, in that they're, you know, just like we have an acting, you know, vice president who does all the jobs of the president when he's incapacitated, but isn't actually the official president. I can have acting officials, right? So he used it to fill about 20% of the cabinet level jobs. And then what Bush did is he waited for Congress to go away on a recess. And they weren't there, and then he appointed the person while they were on recess. So it was a recess appointment. They're not there to object, right? To counter that, what Congress started doing was holding these pro forma sessions. They essentially went away on recess, but they left a few people behind. And the few people behind would literally come up in the morning and they would have this pro forma session. They would literally bang the gavel and kind of call the empty chamber to order. And 30 seconds later, they'd conclude the day. But they were there, right? Meaning you can't appoint a recess appointment. We're still here. We're still technically in session.
That's the easiest job in the world.
Yeah, it was, you didn't get to go home to friends and family, but, for 7 weeks, you kind of made sure that a recess appointment couldn't get through. So that's kind of a couple of other trapdoor things that you could add to sophisticated. In terms of treaties, which I already mentioned, typically given the global consensus you go along with, if there is obstruction, there's a couple of other tactics that presidents have used in the past. There's something called the fast track. So the way that the president frames this up legally is, I am negotiating a treaty, you're going to have to, as part of the terms of the treaty, there are no amendments to it. You don't get to add amendments, which would literally kill the process, because then I gotta go back and negotiate with all these other countries. So you can't add amendments, and it needs an up or down vote within 90 days. You got 3 months to kind of make a determination on that. So that's a tool that the president can use to try to ensure passage. The other thing they can use is something called an executive agreement, and it's kind of like an executive order, only it deals with foreign policy. It's unilateral. And essentially, the rule is, you can make an arrangement as president with a foreign nation, and it essentially can be binding, provided it's not illegal. As long as it's not deemed something illegal, as long as it's consistent with our current legislation, that's fair play. You don't need a positive Senate vote. It's a couple of other trap doors. One of the things that you guys learned in how a bill becomes a law is for every move, there's a counter move. And it's just, if there's not a counter move to that, it's just because we haven't thought of it yet. There invariably would be one, right? This is just an article that kind of shows you again how they stalled on Merrick Garland until the elections that eventually led to Gorsuch getting the Supreme Court position. So again, when they went away over their recess, and their recesses again are mid-July to September, they would hold these pro forma sessions. They would have a brief announcement setting the date for the next meeting, and then they'd shut down the floor. And it only takes a single lawmaker to do this, so they went for 30 seconds. And again, it was a way that they kind of kept in session, so there couldn't be this recess appointment. And they did it, essentially they were able to keep that position vacant for 200 days, which is pretty much a record. It is a record. 200 days without a Supreme Court nominee. And the logic that it was argued on one side was, an election is looming, the American people should be able to speak on who this nominee is. The argument on the other side is, there were plenty of Supreme Court nominees in the final year of the president's term, and we didn't object that, and the position is vacant. So I would leave that up to you guys. How are we doing? We're on the power to convene Congress. One of the things that I'm going to try to show you here, and I'm obviously going to run out of time, is that Congress is kind of like busy a lot, but are they in session a lot? No. They are in session on average 139 days a year. Your academic year, yeah, there's the face. Your academic years, you have to be in school how often? 180. So wait a minute, 139. And when you look at this article, what you see is that they set to adjourn on July 15th. They stayed away until September 6th. They were in session when they came back from September 6th to September 30th, and then they adjourned. till November 14th, after the elections. In election years, it's even worse. This Congress was in session for 111 days. Okay? But does that mean they're not working?
No.
No, they're constantly working. They are, what's my average work day? It's like twice the national average. I've got it, there it is, 70-hour work weeks typically. 10 to 14-hour work days, because they're in committee, they're in districts, they're working on fundraising, they're obviously busy. However, there is a tool while they're on recess to call them back. That's a pretty powerful tool. One of the ways they use it to kind of convene both the House and the Senate and bring them to a formal session. Anybody know? State of the Union. So emergency sessions with State of the Union. I'm going to show you a clip tomorrow. All right? So goodbye to Paul and Allie.
Bye, Ellie.